Hello, humans! It's great to see you. I see a bunch of people turning out and showing up, so feel free to start popping into the comments and letting us know where you're tuning in from, and start queuing up those questions about tech and democracy and politics and whatever. We don't have answers to the election questions, so there's no point in asking us. But what we want to be talking about today is digital's impact on democracy, and also like mobilizing people who are your supporters, whether you're talking about business or politics or wherever. So start thinking about those questions now. But yeah, start chiming in with greetings and tell us where you're tuning in from. So I, of course, am your host, Kate O'Neill. It's nice to see so many of you tuning in. This, as you may know, is a multimedia format program, which means that we're live right now across a bunch of different channels. And the archive of the show will live on each of those platforms. It'll also be turned into an audio podcast a week and a day from today. So today's show will be available as a podcast next Friday, and then last Thursday's show will be available tomorrow as an audio podcast. So that happens every week. And every week we explore different facets of how data and technology shape the human experience. So I hope you'll find that interesting to keep coming back and tuning in. And so please do note that as a live show, we do love to take your comments and questions and incorporate them into the discussion. And I'll do my best to vet those comments and questions in real time. I might not get to all of them, so please be patient with us, but we do very much appreciate you being here and being part of the show. So now to introduce our wonderful guest. Today, we will be chatting with Caleb Gardner, who in his more than a decade of experience in digital leadership, entrepreneurship, and social impact, has worked for a variety of organizations in the public and private sectors, including at prestigious professional service firms like Bain Company and Edelman. During the second Obama administration, he was the lead digital strategist for President Obama's political advocacy group, OFA. He brought his unique insights to growing one of the largest digital programs in existence, with a millions-strong email list and massive social media following, including the largest Twitter account in the world. Now, as a founding partner of 18 Coffees, a strategy firm working at the intersection of digital innovation, social change, and the future of work, he's helping forward-thinking companies and nonprofits adapt and evolve to meet the challenges of today's economy. He speaks, trains, and leads workshops around the world on topics related to change, including strategy and emission economy, technology and innovation for a better world, and change management at the speed of digital. So, audience, keep getting those questions ready for our outstanding guest. And with that, please welcome my friend, Caleb Gardner. Caleb, you are live on the Tech Humanist Show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here.
Me too. It gives us something to do while we're waiting for.
Right. We gotta spin the wheels, manage our stress levels, one way or another.
Yeah. So that's my first question for you. Like, what have you been stress eating?
I feel like it is both fortunate and unfortunate, the intersection of Halloween and the election, because all we have at my house is leftover Halloween candy, and so it's just been one thing after another. I think there's been a couple times the last few days where I've literally gotten sick by eating too much Halloween candy in one setting.
That's got to be so relatable. And audience, please feel free to chime in with your stress eating as well. We'd love to hear that. So this has been a cuckoo bananas cycle, which we knew it would be going into it. But what would you say are some lessons that you may already be taking away from this most recent campaign and election cycle?
We need to get much better at polling, for one thing. I mean, another cycle where the polling just was very off, and off consistently in one direction, right? That's what's so weird and frustrating about it. That's one thing I take away, and is not an industry that I have worked in. I just know that it's an industry that me, like every other citizen paying attention to the election, relies on. And so we're going to have to get better at that. I mean, things that are more related to what you and I have talked about in our spare time is the continued rise of misinformation and disinformation. I think domestically grown in the last year. We were so worried about foreign interference the last time, and this time it's all kind of what's the phrase? It's all coming from within the house,
Yeah, the
right?
call is coming from within the house.
Yes, the call is coming from
From
within the
inside the
house.
house. Yeah. Yeah,
It,
that's true.
so that's been really frustrating. And I think the tech platforms like Twitter and Facebook are beginning to wrap their heads around how to manage that. But again, it just took them so late to do it. I saw someone tweet today that doing the bare minimum of flagging how the Trump campaign is like claiming victory or saying
Yeah.
stop the vote, or like even putting a warning label on some of those about like the mistruths there, took so much convincing. And it just feels like the bare minimum. So there's so much that we have to do in terms of still just regulating, the spread of misinformation on those platforms. It's kind of crazy. I mean, it's happening in real time right now as people are chanting "count the vote"
Right.
or "stop counting the vote," depending on what state you're in. Facebook groups are popping up, like mobilizing those folks. It's not good, Kate. It's not great.
It is bonkers. And what I wanted to ask you though is, your first point about the polls. I wonder, do you feel like it's too soon to say we need? I mean, obviously we need better polling because better polling will always be better. But do you feel like it's too soon to criticize the polling for this election cycle because we still haven't seen the full suite of results, right?
I don't think it's too, yes, there's some things we still need to wait on, but I don't think it's too soon to know that, for instance, Sarah Gideon's polling in Maine was very off for a
Right.
long time. Like for the presidential, yes, we gotta kind of wait and see how off the margins actually are. But plenty of down ballot races, we know how wrong they were. And I think what's frustrating about people working on those campaigns is you make decisions based on the data points that you have, and if you're making decisions thinking that the election is going in one direction, it's actually going in another, you're not, running the right kind of campaign that you actually need to run. And so I know it's really frustrating for staff on the ground there. I think it's frustrating just for me personally, as obviously having worked for Obama, having one political lean versus another, it's frustrating for me that the polling errors again keep going in the same direction. And so it seems like something that we have not kind of wrapped our heads around, or the polling industry specifically hasn't wrapped their heads around how to poll this electorate with Trump on the ballot in a correct way.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. It does seem like there's going to need to be a reckoning with the level of candor that poll subjects have with pollsters, and why people may be more inclined to mislead and misdirect with their answers than they would be in other
Yeah.
scenarios.
I don't know if it's that they're misleading or if the right people just are literally not picking up. I
Yeah,
mean, if you think about, I think I heard this on a podcast the other day. They were thinking about if you've lost faith in government institutions, or if you are disillusioned and you're looking for someone to kind of blow up the system, why would you answer the call of a pollster and like talk about that? Like, you've given up on the entire system, so maybe you're not even answering that, right?
yeah.
Like, I don't know. That could be. There seems like there's a few plausible explanations, but it definitely just, there's got to be a better system for this. I also just don't know if I've been thinking about this a lot from a digital strategy side of just how much every political cycle now feels like everyone burning each other's house down in terms of trying to get their fundraising goals, trying to get their messaging goals, trying to like run the campaign they need to run on top of everyone else running the campaign they need to run. It's become this kind of massive tragedy of the commons situation where I now get, because I'm on some like Democratic email lists and some Democratic phone lists, I now get emails and texts from 1,000 different people
Yeah.
every week, most of which I didn't sign up for. Like, there's no opt-in process to, and it's just, I don't know if that's also turning people away. Like, there's a lot of soul searching I think we need to do about how these campaigns run and what data points we're using to guide and make strategic decisions, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point because it does seem like the email and text marketing has just been out of control this last cycle. And just like you, I signed up, I donated to a handful of down ballot races, and then ended
Yeah.
up on hundreds of
Hmm.
PAC and super PAC, email distributions, And you can tell like you've made it onto different ones because the tone is so different, and they all have like varying levels of credibility that come across, and hysteria and everything. So
Yeah. A
yeah,
few years ago, I started adding, you know how in Gmail you can add, like, if you add the plus sign, you can add all kinds of like tags onto your
right.
email, and you can actually track what email lists are being traded that way. Because I would add myself to, let's say, a Joe Biden email list
Mm-hmm.
and put just like a plus JB or something at the end of my email, so I would know that that was what email list I had signed up for.
Yeah.
And then when I got traded around on some of those super PACs, I could actually tell where I originally got, like, where that email address came from and who was actually giving out some of that data. I used to do that for every email list I signed up for, but
Right.
the political ones, I mean, it's just,
I
they
was really
just,
disciplined
every
about that for
cycle.
a while too, but there's your first actionable takeaway, audience. use that Gmail trick of the plus with the JD or whatever little shorthand
Yeah.
you want to use for whatever thing you're signing up for, and at least that gives you some transparency about why the heck am I receiving this many emails. And you don't get to do that with text messages, of course, so
Yeah, I know.
it's just a
Ugh.
banana situation. So let's talk a little bit about, you know, I really want to I'll get to in a minute. I want to ask you about your experience with Obama and OFA, but I want to talk about, you know, stay on this idea of what we're learning from this cycle. And one of the things that it feels like we can take away from this is the notion of building momentum off election cycle towards the kind of progress that you want to see. And it feels like
Sure.
we saw, you know, the push with the Sunrise Movement to the left, and we saw, you know, a lot of, you know, the Green New Deal and a lot of things that were pushing to the left, and it forced the mainstream Democratic candidates to accept further left positions. And I would imagine that if, you know, if we were inclined toward the right, that we might say similar things happening there too. I think that it's been an interesting process of us learning as political strategists or people who are adjacent to it or observing it, what it looks like to be strategic all the time, and then to use elections in a particular way. Are you thinking about that too? Is that kind of one of the things you're taking away, since some of the work you were doing did have to do with that kind of momentum building and advocacy, and it seems really relevant to the work you do now?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, especially, I think, because this moment, as we've been waiting for votes to come in, hasn't been as decisive. Like, there wasn't a Tuesday night winner called where we could all go, oh, you know, that's over. Joe Biden's going to ride his coattails into the White House, you know. And I think if there had been what felt more like a blue wave come through on Tuesday, I think it would have led to a lot more complacency than what we are right now. It feels like there's a lot more work to do. And I actually think that's, if there's a silver lining in this like stressful moment we're in, and if there's a silver lining in divided government, which it's increasingly looking like we are going toward, which is going to be very frustrating, it is that people aren't going to feel like, okay, now I'm done with my political life and I can go back to brunch. Like, we're all going to feel like we have to stay engaged. And I think that's the right call. I do think that there is, to your point, a lot of in the political world, we say, like, in between cycle organizing happening now, a lot more than had been in the past, or at least a lot more that is surfaced through things like social media that we can see than had happening in the past. I also think that there's been really, really great infrastructure building in between cycles that has been happening. I'm sure it's been happening on both sides, but obviously having more views into things like what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. Like, there's a reason why Georgia is still not called right now, and it has a lot of credit to her and the organization she's built on the ground in Georgia. I think the reason why people had their eyes on Texas is a lot of the work that Beto O'Rourke and other people have been doing to organize on the ground in Texas. So there's also this, like, people feel like when you pour a lot of money to a state or a race and then you don't win that race, it's wasted money. And actually, there's a lot of organization and infrastructure that gets built that you can actually use next time. And so these things take a few cycles to build up momentum to really make change for.
Boy, that's a really hopeful and optimistic framing. And Stacey Abrams was 100% who I had in mind when I asked that question. And I also am thinking about, you know, a couple of maybe months ago at this point, Anand Giridharadas did an interview with Noam Chomsky, and I remember the one thing I really took away with that was Noam saying, the vote is a strategic move, like it's a chess move, and you have to use the in between vote to haunt the dreams of the elected, of the politicians, right? Like, vote for Biden, he was saying basically, like, and then haunt my dreams. Make sure that, you're coming back and you're just staying on the elected representatives. But I love that how you're positioning the idea of, of it as an investment of, someone like Jamie Harrison, not being able to successfully mount a campaign against Lindsey Graham, that is still an investment. That's potentially something that could pay off in further.
Makes the next cycles. Jamie Harrison be a lot easier to get over that threshold. 100%.
That's wonderful. What a optimistic way to think about this. I understand. I realize, and I'm just gonna say once for this. I realize that this is going to come off as highly partisan, and I sort of apologize to the listeners and viewers who don't 100% align with my views or with maybe Caleb's views. I hope that there's still value in this discussion, and that you can take away, some insights and some strategies that are useful to you. But I'm not. I definitely feel like I'm going to be pretty transparent about my political views on this. I'm sure Caleb will as well. By the way,
it's a hard moment not to be.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I want to show off my new mug. By the way, that's a new thing because my viewers were making fun of me for always drinking out of so many different containers. But I do still have my little water in a wine glass. I'm not completely abandoning my multi-container drinking pattern.
We as guests on the show, we get to have one of those mugs, right? You send out little Tech Humanist mugs to all of us now.
I will happily do that. It's your Christmas present.
Yeah, that's right.
So this idea of kind of taking even a loss, a short-term loss, and thinking about it as a long-term strategy. To me, that feels like it may even be a good pivot into thinking about the digital organizing process and practices that align with the best outcomes. Like thinking about how to build momentum toward the long-term outcome that you want to see. What have you learned in the years of? I mean, first of all, as being a strategist and a digital strategist, and then working. Associated, if you're affiliated with the highest office in this country, and coming away from that and starting your own business, there's a lot of ways in which I feel like you've taken some understanding of what a short-term win or loss looks like, and then and moving whatever you have into the long term. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, totally. It's related. It actually relates back a lot to what we were just talking about. Kind of the massive kind of digital tragedy of the commons that happens every election cycle, where everyone is just kind of fighting for every dollar and fighting for every attention of every voter to get out and volunteer and do XYZ. All that stuff really matters. The reason why I get so nervous about things like list swapping and texting people who didn't ask any kind of permission for it, and fake emails with like 300% matches, and you're like, what are you even talking about? 300% matches is not even a thing. Is because it actually makes it a lot harder to build relationships over the long term. You basically use the cycle as a campaign manager, as a strategist for that cycle. All you care about is what happens on election day. So I totally get, like, for your goals as a campaign, you are like, I am aimed at one thing and I will do whatever it takes to get my candidate in office. Totally get that. But what happens is in between cycles, we're not building relationships like we actually should to be able to do the kind of long-term organizing work that you're just talking about in terms of Noam Chomsky being able to say, like, okay, we got Biden into office. Now, how are we going to hold his feet on to the fire for things like climate change, for the minimum wage, for whatever issue it might that might come up?
And make sure we're moving the Overton window to where we need it to be for the next cycle. Totally,
yeah. That work is a lot harder and it's a lot more invisible. It's I've been more encouraged in the last 4 years because you've seen organizations pop up like the Sunrise Movement or like Swing Left that are trying to do some more long-term relationship building with their volunteer base and with their donor base that they can then activate for on behalf of campaigns and be a little bit both kind of in that holding the feet to the fire advocacy world, but also in the electoral world when there's a specific candidate that they want to get into office. But those worlds don't always align perfectly with their goals for exactly the reasons I was talking about. One has long-term relationship building goals. One has short-term, very specifically focused goals. I think if I were in the kind of democratic strategy ecosphere still, that's one thing. I mean, we were even talking about that dynamic back in 2014, 2015, about the relationships between advocacy groups, organizations like the DCCC, electoral organizations, campaigns, and how, those goals often clashed and how we supported each other and how we kind of took attention away from each other. I don't think anyone's really figured that part out yet. But to me, we have to figure out how we can keep everyone's kind of rapt attention on the goalposts when it comes to like the midterm elections in 2022 and taking the Senate back, or else we're going to have divided government for a long time. We're not going to get anything done. I think what's tough about the spot that we're in is that our issues are really big and urgent. And if we do end up going into divided government, we are going to be making progress by increments, and it's going to feel really frustrating to people who just spent a ton of time and energy into getting Joe Biden into office. And so there needs to be some like realistic vision setting with like what we can achieve in specific amounts of time. That like time dynamic to me is one that I think about a lot, about just like horizons of progress. Obama used to talk about like that old King quote about the arc of what is it? The arc of history bends toward justice. Right, toward justice. But it bends toward justice. Like we are so in our immediate if we don't get Medicare for all passed tomorrow, then the whole Democratic Party is a failure. And it's like, wait, hold on. This is actually a lot harder than you think it is. Yeah. So we need to we need to reframe our expectations, because we now live in a world that wants satisfaction immediately, and this work is hard and takes a really, really long time.
Yeah, it's hard to, I think, maintain that appropriate balance of an activist's urgency and a historian's sense of perspective. But it does seem like those are two very valid, kind of voices to have on each shoulder, kind of guiding.
But I actually really get why the activist urgency is taking such prominence now, because some of the issues we're facing, I mean, let's take away the fact that we're in a global pandemic and literally people are dying from mismanagement, but climate change, speaking of the Sunrise Movement, is becoming more urgent by the day, and we have not taken big, bold action. So I can understand why you, as a young Greta Thunberg climate activist, are we are not doing enough and beating that drum every single day. But how do we reconcile that with compromise and the kind of democratic government that we have? I don't know. That's a really, really tough challenge.
I think, I wonder about something like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that's a framework of change toward a time frame of 2030. Do you ever imagine that there could be something that's parallel specifically for the U.S., thinking about the challenges that we need to mount within our own context and our own borders, in alignment with those, of course, because we are part of the world, but to specifically address the context of our own country? Who would be the body that would define those goals? And I have something at my door. And who would be the body that would define them, and who would be the body that would measure them? And is there something that you could imagine taking place that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I want to say that there's anything that we could do if we actually had the energy and efficacy as a governing body in a democracy to do it. Who actually would do it? Probably. I mean, this is trouble with having an administration that turns over every 4 years, right? The Paris Climate Accords should have been that. Yeah. And then we left it literally 2 days ago. And now if Biden becomes back in administration, we're going to rejoin it. So much of, because Congress has been so deadlocked, so much of our governing has been by executive order, and that's just it's not a good way, to your point, to do long-term strategy.
Right.
So
Right. So speaking of decisions that get made now that maybe have consequences further down the road, I wonder about, how do you think about the types of strategies and tactics that Obama and his campaign used in the initial election, and then specifically in the re-election, and then of course your group taking over and kind of cultivating those digital assets. I think there seems like there's a way to look at that says that was a really wonderful thing because it got us this wonderful administration. It's also possible to say those tactics were co-opted by the Republican Party, and then were expanded, and then were co-opted by bad actors and by foreign actors, and so on. So, is there a way to put this into context that we think about creating, using digital organizing practices that only align with the best outcomes, that maybe are intentionally reduced, like the harms are reduced within them, the potential harms when they're used in different capacities or at different scales. Do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think about in terms of how we ran long-term digital organizing efforts, and what I'll just kind of broadly paint as a brush is like the political ecosystem that we have right now. The easiest way to think about it, I think, is in terms of how we used social media and how we used email. Mm-hmm. Like that's the most concrete ways. I'll put SMS aside because I think it was less mature medium than it has become now.
Sure.
And also there's still a lot of really random telecom overlay problems with that industry that are have not caught up with what is possible. It's very strange. Anyway, but take those two mediums, how social has changed just in the past few years. I mean, when we were running the Obama team, I like to say it was bridging the gap between when people really saw it as a potent political force and when people went, oh, that force doesn't necessarily mean for good. Between the years of 2013 and 2016 is when it's Arab Spring, Obama's reelection, when people were like, oh my God, look at the power of social media to do all this good. And then 2015, 2016, Donald Trump uses it to get elected. Russian disinformation. I mean, so all the stories. And in between that, you've got this story from Facebook. I don't know if you remember this about emotional manipulation that they did that big study 2014 where they were like, look how much we can affect, people's emotional outcomes just by tweaking our algorithm. And by 2016, they were like, just kidding, we never said that.
Right.
But that was the environment that we were operating in social media. And so where we are now, again, is just the potential is there, but we haven't reconciled, how do you actually create an equitable public square that allows people to have a voice who couldn't have a voice, allows us to find candidates that would never have been able to get the kind of media attention in a normal, mainstream, quote unquote, media environment, but they can use social media to talk about their platform without kind of allowing the kind of worst dregs of society to also organize around misinformation or, intimidation or racism or all the other kind of bad isms. So that's on the social media side. That's what people are dealing with today. On the email side, it's a lot of what we were talking about in terms of people have now just taken to all kinds of kind of crazy voter match, donation match kind of fairy tales, list swapping. And I'm frustrated by it because we put so much editorial thought into how do we create a theory of change with what we are doing here that explains to people this policy issue, tries to distill it down, explains why if they take this particular action we're asking them to take, it matters right now, and paints it back to the bigger picture of how we're trying to achieve this policy goal together. And it doesn't, I wouldn't say the Biden campaign did this, but this is just a kind of general painting the brush of the political ecosystem we're in. There's just so many people that don't treat their lists with the kind of respect that we try to treat people with, and try to actually build like trusted relationships over time. So those are the two things that I'm the most concerned about going forward. And just to be honest, like, I don't think there's easy answers to either of those things.
Yeah.
Like, there's a reason why people keep doing the like crazy email matching, fundraising, like sending 1,000 emails a day. There's a reason why we get text messages from all kinds of different campaigns and political action groups. It's because it is a way, if you do it enough at scale, to get people to do things. Like, you can reach your goals if you do this. The problem is, again, it just burns everyone's house down, right?
Yeah, but I like what you're pointing out about, this carefully crafted theory of change and the narrative building and everything. That feels like it's a really object lesson for anyone working in any kind of capacity where they're trying to build community and they're trying to build long-term momentum to something that, even when you think about, I think a lot about what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And,
sure.
Obviously, you can talk about an intent. And with disinformation, it's intention to deceive and misdirect and everything. With misinformation, it may simply be that something sensationalistic has caught on, and it's impossible to rein it back in once people get excited about it. But if you're dealing with, it seems to me from what you've just laid out, if you're dealing from within a model that has a robust theory of change and a robust narrative, it feels like that might create a better environment from which to navigate those types of the misinformation and the disinformation. That you would be in a position, because you have cultivated trust, because you have cultivated this community,
right,
to be able to combat that better. It just seems like it makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were specific issues for our sake. Just taking back to the example of the team we ran, there were specific things that came up in 2015, 2016 around, let's say, trade policy, where there were a lot of rumors going around about trade policy and the Obama administration navigating trade policy with Asia, that they specifically had to say, like, does what you were hearing about how I'm navigating trade policy sound like Obama to you? Like it was like where the president had to trade on some of that trust with the progressive community. The one thing about what you were saying about the transferability of that model is we have actually taken it as 18 copies and applied very similar persuasion kind of long-term relationship building tactics in what I will call the change management space within corporate environments. Just kind of
about that, because I'd love to hear more about how you're finding that to be. Like, obviously, it seems like targeting and affinity building and coalition building and that sort of thing does feel like it has direct transferability into
it
that.
Does,
sort of
especially for larger organizations where, again, right, rumor persists. Like the penchant for like rumor mill to create its own kind of misinformation ecosystem when you're trying to do a big change initiative, right? Like what we've tried to get across to our clients is persuasion is kind of, it's not just a tool in your tool belt. It has to be like one of the things you are doing constantly. Like in the media environment that we are in, when we are inundated with 1,000 different messages every day, 1,000 different media points, we're all carrying around like the world's most powerful communication devices known to man in our pockets every single day. Like, you have to be actively bringing people along, telling them a story, trying to make them understand what their part or their role in that story has to be in order to make change in your organization and kind of turn the Titanic of your organization toward any kind of end goal. Like there's a lot of applicability there. We're doing a big project with United Way Worldwide right now that involves, basically a big transformation effort within the United Way network. And if you know anything about the United Way network, it is very community centric and very disintermediated in terms of there being United Way of Greater Chicago, United Way of the Twin Cities, United Way, they have built this model that has worked really well to get to know the local communities, but hasn't really worked that well to support each other as a network. And so as they try to come in and create a network-wide United Way vision and about, sharing technology, sharing data, about, making the whole network work better together, they've had to do a lot of persuasion, a lot of convincing to these local United Ways and their boards and their staff about the direction that they're moving in.
That's cool. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think it proves that you need to know what you believe in organizationally.
Yes.
Right? There has to be, and I think, we talk a lot about mission driven or purpose driven companies, but I find that even in my work when I'm talking to companies about, using data and tech to improve human experiences, but also become more successful, so often we have to start from this place of talking about purpose. And I always say, like, it isn't necessarily this touchy-feely thing. It is really about having a strategic organizing principle for the company about why do you even exist and what are you trying to accomplish. But even that feels like it's a little esoteric or, off of what people are normally thinking when they're thinking about a company or about how a company operates. So it's wonderful to hear you bring it back to, in order to get that momentum and create that kind of advocacy and community building, it has to come from this clear place of what do you believe in? What are you about? Right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
100%.
So hey, I wonder about just thinking about your personal journey when you ended up going to work for OFA. How did that happen? First of all.
So I live in Chicago, and the Obamas obviously have deep roots in Chicago and ran both the 2008 and 2012 campaign from here. And it was really a just matter of being in the right place at the right time, having met a bunch of the people from the 08 campaign that went on to work on the 12 campaign, having worked with many of them when I was here working at Edelman in Chicago, just having, it was very strange. I mean, on the one hand, being in the right place at the right time in terms of our senator from Illinois going on to be president and just happening to live in his backyard. But on the other hand, actually like working with and getting to know a lot of the people that helped make him president in between the two presidential campaigns. And so, serendipity, I will give a lot to that on top of the fact that just, I kept in touch with a lot of the people that worked on the campaign and tried to help from a volunteer perspective, just like pitching in and, contributing ideas and content wherever I could.
Had you grown up with or, gone through school thinking that you might be in any way involved in politics or political organizing in your lifetime? Really?
So, well, what I'll say is I majored in history when I was in college.
And music, right? That's what I saw on your LinkedIn.
Yeah. I majored in history and minored in music. So clearly I had like a career path in mind. My parents were thrilled. But I know what's weird about it is, I didn't have a career path in mind, but also the career that I've had couldn't have existed when I went to college. Like, it's a very strange thing to think about. Like, there wasn't a major in digital strategy, right, back when I was in college. So I guess on the one hand, it helped me be a more big picture thinker that liked to look at kind of long-term trends and kind of being at the intersection of a presidential campaign and a president and this shift that was happening in society around digital communications, the right place at the right time. That was, both of those things were fascinating to me for many reasons.
Yeah. I wonder too about, that must have been in some ways you were working in DC, I'd imagine, right? Or were you working out in Chicago?
I was working in Chicago, just commuting back and forth through the DC, right, here and there. So and that also a lot since I have a family here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was just gonna say, it seems like that's a stressful lifestyle, I would imagine. And since it's been such a stressful time with, the pandemic and this election and so on.
You're seeing my gray hair now. Huh?
Yeah.
Is that what
I'm just, looking at my own and thinking about all of us. I feel like you must be able to teach us a thing or two about handling stress and maintaining calm in high stakes moments. And that feels like the question I really am building up to ask you is, really, when do you think about and what do you think about that we need to do to foster more of a sense of like balance and proportion when we're dealing with these high stakes moments like we are now, like waiting for a tight election to be called? And since especially we've already been cautioned that results could take longer than we are used to. It could be days or longer, and people just seem determined to be stressed out. But I don't think it's just our fault. I think, the handling of the story in the media isn't helping, like the jittery needles in the New York Times data visualization,
My
like
God, yeah.
PTSD from 2016 for many of us.
Uh-huh.
And I also don't think there's been a strong showing from many of our top institutions to set like a clear-headed example about this. So what do you think about in terms of what we most need societally, culturally, maybe individually, to help counterbalance this and help manage our skills at this?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say societally, culturally, individually, because I actually think, given how individualized a lot of our media experience is right now, we can't think about those separately anymore. Like we
Right.
actually we do have to talk about like what is our own individual responsibility to be critical about the media we read, to be critical about what we share and don't share online, with how do we build institutions and stop gaps in our media environment and our technology environment to make sure that we are controlling the system and making sure the system is healthy, right? In terms of what can we do to accurately set expectations, it's funny is I think the news media, and I'll paint a broad brush with
Sure.
like, most of the mainstream outlets, did a relatively good job setting expectations about how long the counts were going to take. Like I actually think that they talked about it quite a bit in the lead up. The responsible campaigns out there talked about it quite a bit in the lead up, trying to set expectations. I think the hard thing is we just have muscle memory about when we get to know these things. I think that's what's been, if I were to point at why I was stressed out Tuesday night, I think it was a combination of having muscle memory of just knowing as soon as we can on election night or late into election night, and like setting our own expectations unrealistically high about, for me, a reputation of the last 4 years, and wanting there to be such a powerful kind of blowback that we could kind of gain some of our global reputation back. Like that's what I think. I'm still a little bit grieving that narrative didn't come out of Tuesday night. But it's you're absolutely right that at the end of the day, if things go like we think they're going to go, Biden could win over 300 electoral votes and more than 7 million in the popular vote. So like it could actually be a pretty strong backlash against the sitting president, which is actually pretty hard to unseat an incumbent president.
Right.
But it's not going to feel that way because we didn't get it like immediately, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that's fair. It feels like it's maybe circumstantial in some ways because of the pandemic, because of the shift many states had to make on the fly almost to absentee and early voting, that they weren't prepared, or that they encountered different kinds of resistance to trying to get prepared, and so certainly there's some unpacking to do about that.
I've actually been really fascinated the last few years with just thinking about our perception of time in general. Like, have you ever heard of the return trip effect? This like psychological phenomenon that like if you're going to Disneyland, this is always the example people use. If you're going to Disneyland, it feels like forever. Like you've got it on the calendar, it's in 3 weeks, as 3 weeks take forever. And then you finally get there. And when you're going home, you're like, oh, that didn't take long at all. Like our perceived like anticipation warps our sense of time and more than we recognize that it does.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about how 2020 has been all about anticipation. When is this pandemic going to end? When are my kids going to get to go back to school? When are we finally going to get to this election? And how much that's kind of warped our satisfaction with getting any answers to any of those things, I think has a big effect.
Yeah, that's a really smart observation. And it also, it's been my experience that that trauma warps your perception of time, and we're all living through various kinds of trauma. So that's part of it too, for sure. I remember when I was working at a startup in California years and years ago, there was a colleague of mine who was really into physics, and we were out at some restaurant for lunch where they had the paper placemats and crayons that kids could draw, and he was drawing something, and he said something like, or I think I was drawing something with the crayons, but he said something out loud that was like, they expanded time but compressed space, so it was okay. And whatever that it was he was talking about, I remember just latching on to that phrase, and it's been kind of a constant companion of mine for all these years, this idea that, at the times when our perception of time changes because of trauma or because of stress or because of whatever, our perception of space also changes, in the sense that we perceive less of the horizon or more of the horizon, kind of in indirect proportion. Yeah. And it changes our sense of balance and perspective. And I think that is something that we don't talk about often enough, because we know that there's this sense that 2020 has felt both interminable and short in weird ways. Like, it still feels like it's March, and it also feels like, how can this possibly be, Thursday already?
Right, yes.
It's a bizarre phenomenon, but I think we don't do enough talking and understanding about human perception of things like time. So that's a really unexpected departure for us.
Because we've been taught to think about time in these like incremental, we've literally broken up our days into these like very measurable increments, and that's what we think of as time.
Yeah, and I mean, even the notion of 2020, the arbitrary year, as like this bucket of evil, or this this bucket of bad things that are happening, is of course absurd, and there's no validity to the idea that 2020 has any malice in it for us.
Yeah, there's no morality associated with 2020 the year.
But it's a really tempting way to conceive of things. And so I guess I wonder, I don't know, maybe politics needs philosophers a little more to be able to, bring a lot of these different kinds of ideas together, to be able to understand, that the activist urgency and the historian's sense of like long perspective and the ability to tell this theory of change narrative and all this stuff, it feels like that's a lot of what you sound like you've been able to do in your career, is bring together some disparate ideas, maybe having a music co-major as part of it. Did you also do some sort of like study abroad thing? I was trying to figure out what this other education
I did.
Yeah, what was that?
Yeah, I studied abroad in Florence my senior year, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, you got that.
I mean, amazing
Florence
experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got that Florence art perspective, and it shaped you, it seems like.
Yeah, I was talking to someone recently about how travel creates empathy. Like literally being immersed in other cultures, getting to meet other people creates like more empathetic people. And I was actually thinking recently about how that may be one of the things that we miss most about 2020. It's literally like we have to somehow become still empathetic when we can't actually be around people.
Maybe that's a good test. Maybe that's the thing we most, and to bring this around back into, how digital tools help us as humans. Like, how can we use the digital tools that we have at our disposal to create more empathy if we can't travel and we can't be in person and we can't have these, kind of nuanced meetings with one another where we're picking up on sensory cues that help us understand each other and have more empathy with each other. So I guess what that leads into is my question to you is, what can we do with digital tools and with technology and with data to create, I mean, on one hand, a better digital citizenship platform? Like, where do you go there, first of all? And then I guess, feel free to expound from there into, like, how do we use it in broader senses, too, to create more community and more connection?
That's such a good question. And it's thinking about it in terms of a digital citizenship platform almost makes me think, like, if you were running for office and you wanted to run on the platform of like creating better digital citizens, what would you say? I think first of all, it's a tragedy that we haven't started teaching civics and citizenship across the board in a way that, reflects the current kind of connected reality that we all live in. So like a combination of teaching civics, which for some reason in our educational institutions, we just stopped doing. Like, we just don't do it very much. It's not a core part of the curriculum anymore for a lot of high schools, for example. But combined with the kind of media literacy that sends people out into the world understanding that not everything on the internet is true, right?
Right.
Like, some combination of those, like, here's how our government and like democracy works, and here are your expectations as a citizen in terms of participation. Thinking about democracy as a verb, right? Like, it's not just I'm going to work and get this one guy who's going to fix everything into office. It's like I have to actively participate to see the kind of goals and outcomes that I want to see, combined with, hey, we actually have a real personal responsibility to be people that understand how to communicate with each other, that understand how to have empathy with each other online, that understand how powerful these tools actually are. Like, one of the things that I've been wrestling with the last few years is we have not actually, like, I kind of compare us collectively to Peter Parker in the Spider-Man story, that like we got amazing powers overnight with these devices from the standpoint of history, like literally the last like 10 years. And yet we have not had our collective, like, with great power comes great responsibility moment, right? Like, we just don't think about this in terms of its ability to do harm or good in the way that we should. So like teaching that kind of responsibility, I think, is really important. I think it's a tragedy how some of our institutions have not enabled that more. Like, we are I know we have this like crazy founding father and constitution reverence, but we're literally like running our country on a document that was created more than 200 years ago, that didn't know Amazon would be a thing. I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. So like updating our actual institutions themselves, I think, and like democracy reform is one of the things that I'm the most honestly sad about when it comes to not having the Senate next year. So I don't know, there's probably like 3 or 4 other things if I thought hard enough about it. But to me, that's a good start. Like, let's make our like actual democratic environment more equitable and actually help us understand and wrap our heads around what it means to be a good citizen in a digital world.
Yeah. By the way, have you seen on Amazon the show, it's a staging of the Broadway play, What the Constitution Means to Me?
No, I have it on my list. Somebody just was telling me about it last week. Is it good?
Yeah, it is good, and I recommend it to everyone in the audience too. There's a reference specifically when you talk about the Constitution being this, old document, that the woman, I can't think of her name, that's doing this, basically, sort of fundamentally it's a one-woman show, but she does have a few other players. But she's talking about how the framers, or at least some of the framers, never intended it to be a document that wouldn't be updated and replaced at a really foundational level, like not
all
just with amendments, here and there, but with a re-understanding, like a recontextualization of where it fits in society. Which that may be something that people who are more scholarly and more informed about this particular subject could debate, but it feels like that's a really sound starting point for a debate, and we should really understand.
I have read that exact thing from a lot of like constitutional scholars, especially in the last like month, as we've been talking about the role of the Supreme Court and originalism and how to interpret the Constitution.
Yeah, I think that's really worth people going and watching that and considering that discussion. And take it with a grain of salt. Maybe you don't agree with it when you watch it, but I think it's worth having that as a thought provoker, as a starting point. So really quickly,
I find myself not watching those things because it feels like so much emotional work, and already, like, when somebody told me to go watch that, I was like, the election's next week. I'm gonna put that off for a little bit. There's enough going on right now.
Yeah, and maybe now is not the time, but it was, I think, leading up to the election, it was a really good time for me because it felt like it was a downtime moment, but also something that felt like it was a little bit engaged still. So yeah, maybe when you're ready for that. I was gonna say, just sort of a lightning round almost of like nuts and bolts. Do you think online voting is a way to go, or should go back to paper? Is there blockchain? What do you picture as the sort of nuts and bolts evolution of voting to make it more equitable, more trustworthy, all of that?
So there's a lot of security concerns around online voting and mobile voting that have not been ironed out. And every election security, expert that I've read or listened to in the last few years has basically been like this to like anything being online, until there's a lot more things that happen around security. We have such a decentralized election process, and a lot of people don't realize it. Like, so many people are like, will yell at the DNC because like someone in Missouri screwed up some. It's like, no, that's that's a Missouri problem. Like these are very, very localized organizations that run all this. So, I think before we get to thinking about will online voting make things more democratic, I would like to see universal voter registration or even mandatory voting. To me, like there's many countries that have mandatory voting and have seen, lots of positive outcomes. So if we thought like, how can we remove the barriers and just make it easier on people to vote first, like universal registration. How about we move election day to a Saturday, not a random day in the middle of the week? We mandate, or at least make it a mandatory like company holiday. Like there's so many things that we could do to just make it easier for people, on top of the like voter ID and signature requirements and all kinds of like random bureaucracy people have to navigate just to like exercise a constitutional right. It's insane.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like there's states that have really figured it out, like Oregon. Everything's
Yeah.
mail-in, and like I moved.
Colorado's done great mail-in voting for years. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's definitely states that have done this well.
yeah. I moved to New York 5 years ago, and it was the first state I'd ever lived in that didn't have early voting or absentee voting, or that you would have to have a credible excuse to get an absentee ballot. And it was startling to me. I was just like, what? How is New York a state that doesn't have this figured out? But yeah, there's so many kinks in so many parts of every state's election process that we do need to
Yeah,
work that out. That's fair.
yeah, definitely.
Hey, before we run out of time, I want to make sure people know where they can find and follow you and your work online.
Yeah, thank you. You can follow me at Caleb Gardner on just about every social platform, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Although you and I know we both have kind of a contentious relationship with Facebook these days, so I'm not hanging out there as much as I used to. That's probably the easiest way. You can go to calebgardner.com, read more about my work, or 18coffees.com, read more about our work. We're deep in this kind of mix of digital transformation and community organizing work on any given day, and so please do keep in touch. It'd be great to meet and hear from some of the people that were listening in.
Yeah, and I want to, with just the 1 or 2 minutes that remain, I want to give you a chance to end on an up note, an optimistic note. So one of the recurring show questions that I like to ask is what, when it comes to technology or data or digital experiences or the future of human experiences, are you most optimistic about? What do you look at in that sort of category and feel most hopeful about?
Oh, that's such a good question. You're asking me to find hope in a really like stressful, like we're
Hey,
literally
you
in a,
already brought us a ton of hope in this episode.
yeah, I guess so. I am probably the most optimistic about this somebody feel out of left field, but I'm probably most optimistic about technology's ability to help us tackle big global problems like climate change. Like I get really frustrated about that from a policy standpoint, and even talk about disinformation and like not having shared realities around big issues like climate change. I mean, insane. But I'm actually pretty bullish on technology's ability to solve and actually innovate around the reduction of carbon in our atmosphere, electric vehicles, electric grid. And what's great about that is a lot of that's already being driven by a lot of the private sector around the world. So it's not as dependent on government as we think that it is. However, we still do need government policies to set the rules and regulations to make the kind of big leaps in that sector that we need to make. But, I'm definitely more optimistic about our ability to innovate around that than I am in some of our Sunrise Movement or like other, environmental activist friends.
Yeah, and I guess to recap your wonderful points of hope, you were talking about staying focused on the long term, right? Like keeping that long term position or goal post in mind, making sure you know what you believe in and what you're working toward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
But
I wrote
maintaining
down.
that sense of urgency.
Yeah, maintain that sense of urgency. And I also wrote down when you said democracy as a verb. I mean, I think, that mindset is probably what's going to help us make some progress in the years to come.
For sure.
Well, Caleb, thank you so much for bringing your surprisingly optimistic viewpoint to us today.
We need a dose of that, don't we?
We did. We needed it. Well, thank you for being here, and I hope you and your family stay safe in Chicago, where also my family is, and I will look forward to catching up with you in the future. Thank you all for tuning in, for listening and watching, and for sharing this episode and the show. And please, everyone, stay well and keep yourselves in good mental health. Thank you all.